I want to show you what these verses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 are all about. Let's remember where we've been so far in this book. In 1 Thessalonians, back in chapter 1, the Apostle Paul wrote to this church and commended them for how they received the gospel. He was so thankful for them, and he starts giving off all these reasons for why he's thankful for them. Basically, they had set an example of how to receive the gospel really well. Then as you come to chapter 2, Paul recounts how he himself had delivered the gospel. He said, I came like this, not like that. He said, I didn't come in error or impurity or trying to deceive anybody. I didn't come out of greed. Instead, he said, I came like this. I came gentle and working hard and sacrificing for you guys and with boldness. And so they set the example of how to receive the gospel. Paul sets the example of how to deliver the gospel. And so Paul ends chapter 2 kind of with this idea that he's so thankful for them because they received the Word of God as it really was, the Word of God. And he's so thankful for them. Now, they had experienced persecution, just like the Jews had persecuted Christians in Jerusalem and had been guilty of driving the Christians out and displeasing God. And so Paul he loves this church so much, and he wants to go see them. And that brings us back to chapter 3. And in this text, Paul's going to talk about how he's going to recount their history, how he had sent Timothy to them to see how they were going, see how they were doing. Let's look at chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, and we'll see what the Apostle Paul says here. He says, therefore, when we could bear it no longer, that's kind of a neat phrase, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel. Now pause right there for a moment. Paul, why is Paul in agony here? What is it that he can't bear any longer? You actually see that phrase again later in our text. He kind of gets back to this idea in verse 5. When I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith. What is it that Paul is agonizing over here? Well, when Paul had been run out of town for preaching the gospel, he was left wondering, what kind of soil did the seed of the gospel fall on? Do you remember the parable of the soils that Jesus taught? In that parable, some seed falls on the good ground and the good soil, and it sprouts up and bears fruit. But other seed fell on the rocky soil, and even though it sprang up, when persecution came, the plant was choked out and they fell away. And essentially what's going on is Paul is wondering, he's going, I preached and people said they believed, but then persecution came and I was chased out of town, and he's left with this burning question: what kind of soil did that seed fall on? Did it fall on the good soil or the rocky soil? And so he can't stand it any longer. When I could bear it no longer, he's got to find out. And so he sent to learn about your faith. In other words, what kind of soil did the seed fall on? And he sent in fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you and our labor would be in vain. I was worried sick about you guys. Did you truly believe in the gospel, or was it just a short-term phase? So he can't stand it any longer, so he sends Timothy. Now, we learned some things about Timothy here. He says, we sent Timothy, our brother, and another title, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ. Paul has a really high regard for Timothy. Here he calls him his brother. Another place, Paul called Timothy his true child in the faith. Paul calls him his co-worker, God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ. In other words, it's like Paul is seeing Timothy as his fellow soldier. It's like they're in the foxhole together, man. Like these guys love each other, and they work hard together. And so he sends Timothy. Now, why is that a sacrifice? Why is that a sacrifice? He says, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. Why is that such a big deal for Paul? I mean, just send Timothy. Well, think about the last 3 places that Paul had been. Paul went from Philippi to Thessalonica to Berea to Athens. Guess what towns Paul had been chased out of? Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And so the last 3 towns, Paul has been run out of town. Pretty dangerous times. And so this is kind of a danger for Paul to send Timothy back. I mean, they're in this thing together, sharing the foxhole together, but he can't bear it any longer. He's got to know, how is their faith doing? And so he sends Timothy. He sends Timothy back. Why? Well, we saw back in verse 5, he sent him to learn about your faith. But we also see in verse 2 some other reasons. He sent Timothy to establish and to exhort you in your faith. He sent Timothy to establish and exhort. Think back to the parable of the soils. So the word is preached, the seed sprouts up, persecution comes, but some is choked out. Well, what if someone came right as the persecution came and encouraged and established and exhorted the people who heard the gospel? No, stay true. This is worth it. It's worth it to follow Jesus. Might have been a different result. And so he sends Timothy to establish. Now that word establish comes up again in verse 13 of this chapter. He's praying that God may establish your hearts blameless. What's it mean to establish something? It means to cause someone to be inwardly committed, to strengthen or to establish. Paul wants them to stand firm in their faith. And so here's an example of, you think of like a fence post that you put into the ground and it's wobbly. What do you need? Well, that thing needs cement. And so you dig the hole around it, you mix the cement, you pour it in, and it sets. And what's it do? It establishes, it strengthens. That's what those Christians needed. This is what Paul would do. This word, this idea of strengthening the churches, that's what Paul would do. You see this a couple times in Acts 18:23. Says Paul went around, quote, strengthening all the disciples. Or Acts 14:22 says Paul returned to the cities he had visited, quote, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith. And so this is what Paul did. This is what he sends Timothy back to do. And, it just makes me think, this is a good model for us. Young Christians need to be established in their faith. They need to be strengthened in their faith. So do you know a baby Christian, a young Christian? This is part of your role as an older Christian, to come alongside of them and strengthen them and encourage them to continue in their faith. Because the persecution comes, the affliction comes. That's what Paul had been doing. He's saying that Timothy came to establish and exhort them in their faith, so that no one may be moved by these afflictions. And then he's going to talk about these afflictions here. Paul knew that affliction would come. He says that when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction. And by the way, that has come to pass, just as you know. But I want you to notice this phrase. We'll spend a moment on this phrase. He says, for you yourselves know that we are destined for this. We are destined for this. That's an interesting phrase. When Paul became a Christian, God showed him how much he would suffer for the name. Paul knew that he was appointed to this. That word destined can also be translated appointed. It's kind of the same idea. You see this in Philippians 1:16. Paul talks about how he had been appointed for the defense of the gospel. Here's a question. Who destines Christians for affliction? Or who appoints Christians for suffering? Well, I'll tell you who it isn't. It isn't Satan. Satan doesn't appoint Christians to suffer. He doesn't have that kind of power or authority. It's not the persecutors. They don't have the power to destine or appoint someone for suffering. No, the Thessalonians and Paul himself were appointed for persecution, and it was God who did this appointing. This thought, it might come as a shock to you, like, does God really do that kind of a thing? Does God really appoint people to suffering? He does. Let me give you a couple examples. To the church in Philippi, Paul wrote this in Philippians 1:29. He says, "For to you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake." It's been granted to you to believe, and it's been granted to you to suffer. So our faith is a gift from God, but in a sense, this mission of suffering for him, that's the mission that God gives to Christians as well. Now, here's another example. You think of the crucifixion of Jesus. Who appointed Jesus for this mission? Who appointed the persecutors to persecute Jesus? Listen to Acts 4:27. Here's what I'm trying to say. Acts 4:27 says, "For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur." We find here kind of a shocking truth. It's that when Christians experience persecution, this isn't Satan somehow wrestling control out of God and getting the upper hand. It's not God asleep at the wheel. It's they're experiencing something God has appointed for them to experience. God is giving them a specific mission in life. Now, is God to blame for the suffering? No. Does God enjoy watching his people suffer for some terrible reason? No. In fact, when Paul had gone around preaching, when Paul had gone around persecuting the church, Jesus had told him, do you remember this? It's like, when you're persecuting them, you're persecuting me. Why are you persecuting me? So what's going on? Well, Job is kind of a helpful paradigm here. God permitted Job to experience suffering. You might say Job was destined for suffering or appointed for suffering. But what was the result of this? Was Satan the one that was vindicated at the end of the story, or was God the one who was vindicated at the end of that story? Well, God was. Even at the end of the book, Job glorifies God. It says God is the one who's good after all. So all this to say, this is maybe a hard truth that God appoints Christians sometimes, like Jesus, to experience suffering. But he does it for his glory. He does it because, do you know what the result is when a Christian accepts this mission of persecution or suffering and they're loyal to God? The world looks in awe and they say, what kind of a God is this, that his people are so loyal to him? So what's all this mean? It means that God has a purpose. When Christians suffer or when Christians are afflicted, this isn't just random, it's not meaningless. Persecution is not a sign that God has forgotten or abandoned you. It's a sign that God has enlisted you, appointed you. And that's, I think, a comfort. Okay, so that's kind of a tangent there. But Paul knew that suffering would come, that affliction would come. And so he sends Timothy to them because he's got to know. He can't bear it any longer. So he sends Timothy to find out about their faith. Now, in the next paragraph, we're going to see what Timothy reports back to him. And it's going to be good news. All right. Thanks, guys, for joining us. And we will see you again next time.